Part 1: The envelope behind the envelope. The truth that hurts the most is often the truth that arrives after you think the story is over. Several weeks had passed since the quiet afternoon at the cemetery where my father and I finally stood together without anger between us. The autumn leaves had begun to fall across Connecticut, and for the first time in decades, our family seemed to be moving forward instead of looking backward. I spent most mornings sorting through my late mother's belongings. It was not a task I had rushed to complete. Every box held memories. Every photograph carried emotions that still felt fresh. Some days I found myself smiling at old family vacation pictures. Other days I sat quietly for an hour holding one of her handwritten recipes. On a cool Thursday afternoon, I brought several storage boxes down from the attic of the family home. The house felt unusually silent. My father was sitting in the sunroom reading while I worked alone in the dining room. I opened another cardboard box that contained files, greeting cards, and personal letters. Most of the contents had already been reviewed during the months following my mother's passing. I expected nothing surprising. Then I noticed something unusual. At the bottom of the box sat the envelope that had changed everything. It was the envelope my mother had left behind before her death. The one that had exposed years of misunderstandings and helped bring our family back together. Picked it up carefully. As I turned it over, I felt something firm behind it. At first I assumed another piece of paper had become stuck to the back. But when I looked closer, I saw the edge of a second envelope hidden behind the first one. My heart immediately began to race. The second envelope was smaller and sealed. My name was written across the front in my mother's familiar handwriting. I froze. For several seconds I simply stared at it. I knew every curve and stroke of her handwriting by heart. There was no mistake. This had come from her. I slowly sat down and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter folded into thirds. The paper looked older than the first letter. My hands trembled. As I unfolded it, the first sentence immediately made my stomach tighten. My dear daughter, if you are reading this, it means the first envelope has already done what it was meant to do. I continued reading. Your father deserved forgiveness, and your family deserved healing. But there is another truth that I chose not to reveal while emotions were still raw. Some secrets do not heal wounds. Some secrets simply explain them. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. The letter continued. Your father knows part of what I am about to tell you, but not everything. I kept certain details hidden because revealing them too soon would have destroyed relationships that could still be saved. If our family has finally found peace, then perhaps the time has come for you to know the rest. I stopped reading and looked toward the doorway. The room suddenly felt colder. My father was still in the sunroom, unaware of what I had discovered. I turned my attention back to the letter. Several paragraphs later, my mother mentioned something completely unexpected. She wrote about a safety deposit box located somewhere in Connecticut. According to her letter, the box contained documents, photographs, and records she had protected for decades. She explained that the contents would answer questions no one had ever thought to ask. What frightened me most was one sentence written near the bottom of the page. The truth inside that box is not about money. It is not about inheritance. It is about identity. I read the line 3 times. Identity. What could that possibly mean? I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly lowered the letter. My father entered the dining room carrying a cup of coffee. He smiled at first, but the moment his eyes landed on the envelope in my hand, the smile disappeared. The color drained from his face. His expression shifted so suddenly that it felt impossible to miss. For a brief moment I saw fear. Not confusion. Not surprise. Fear. He stared at the envelope without speaking. Then he quietly set his coffee down on the table. Where did you find that? He asked. His voice sounded calm, but something underneath it felt strained. I looked directly at him. After everything we had been through, I thought there were no secrets left between us. But as he continued staring at the envelope, I realized I might have been wrong. And for the first time since our reconciliation, I wondered how much of my family's story still remained hidden in the shadows. Part 2: The key no one recognized. The following morning, I read my mother's letter 3 more times before making any decision. The sentence about the safety deposit box refused to leave my mind. More troubling was my father's reaction. The look on his face when he saw the envelope had not been confusion. It had been recognition. He knew something. Perhaps not everything, but enough to make him uncomfortable. When I finally asked him directly whether he knew anything about the safety deposit box, he remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "I know it exists," he admitted quietly. "Your mother mentioned it once many years ago. She never told me what was inside." That answer felt truthful but incomplete. Before I could ask another question, he reached into his shirt pocket and removed a small brass key. My eyes widened immediately. "She gave this to me almost 20 years ago," he said. "She told me to keep it safe and never ask questions." The key matched the description in my mother's letter perfectly. By noon, my adult son had joined us at the house. After hearing the entire story, he insisted on accompanying us. 3 generations climbed into the same vehicle and headed toward a small bank located in a historic Connecticut town nearly 40 miles away. The drive felt unusually quiet. Normally my son filled every silence with conversation, but even he seemed affected by the growing mystery. My father sat in the back seat staring out the window for most of the trip. Every few minutes, I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He appeared increasingly nervous the closer we got to the bank. The old brick building stood on a corner near the town square. It looked unchanged from another era. Inside, a bank manager reviewed the documents my mother had left behind. After verifying everything, she escorted us into a secure vault area. My father held the brass key with trembling fingers as he inserted it into a narrow lock. The manager used a second key. A moment later, a long metal box slid forward. We carried it into a private room. For several seconds nobody moved. Then I slowly lifted the lid. There was no money, no jewelry, no valuable collectibles. Instead, the box contained carefully organized folders, dozens of photographs, several sealed envelopes, and a thick leather-bound journal. Everything had been arranged with extraordinary care. It was exactly the sort of system my mother would have created. I picked up the journal first. Inside the front cover was a name written in faded ink. It belonged to my grandfather. I had never seen his personal handwriting before. My son began examining the photographs spread across the table. Suddenly he stopped. "Grandma," he said softly, "who is this?" He handed me a black and white photograph. The image appeared to have been taken sometime during the 1950s. My grandfather stood beside several people outside what looked like a church picnic. Most of the faces were familiar from old family albums. One face was not. A young woman stood near the center of the photograph. She appeared comfortable with the group, almost as if she belonged there. Yet I had never seen her before in my life. My father immediately looked away the moment he saw the picture. That reaction caught my attention. "Do you know her?" I asked. He remained silent. "Dad." He sighed heavily. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. Finally he nodded. "Yes." The room became perfectly still. My son looked from me to his grandfather. "Who is she?" he asked. My father rubbed his forehead. "I have seen that photograph before," he said carefully. "Your mother showed it to me many years ago." "Then who is the woman?" I asked. Another long silence followed. "I cannot answer that yet." His words stunned me. After everything we had been through, another secret was standing directly in front of us. I opened my grandfather's journal hoping to find answers. The earliest entries were dated 1954. As I scanned the pages, a pattern quickly emerged. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Several references described a difficult decision made during that decade. A decision my grandfather believed would affect multiple families for generations. One sentence near the bottom of a page immediately caught my attention. "Sometimes protecting one life requires rewriting the future of another." I read it twice. Then a third time. My stomach tightened. The mystery my mother had hidden was clearly much larger than anything involving my parents. The journal suggested that the story began long before I was born. Long before my father met my mother. Perhaps even before our family became the family I thought I knew. As I looked around the room at the photographs, letters, and journal entries spread across the table, I realized something unsettling. The questions were no longer about my mother and father. The questions now reached back into previous generations. And somewhere within those pages, the unknown woman in the photograph was waiting to change everything once again. Part 3: The Woman in the Photograph. The photograph stayed on my mind for days after our visit to the bank. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the young woman standing beside my grandfather. She looked comfortable among the people I recognized. She looked as though she belonged there. Yet somehow she had vanished from every story I had ever heard growing up. What disturbed me most was my father's reaction. He knew exactly who she was, but he refused to tell me. After years of uncovering family secrets, I had learned something important. When multiple people work hard to hide the same truth, that truth usually matters far more than anyone wants to admit. The following week, I began researching the woman myself. Using information from old town directories, census records, newspaper archives, and names mentioned in my grandfather's journal, I slowly started connecting pieces of the puzzle. Several days into my search, I discovered a name that appeared repeatedly beside references from the mid-1950s. The name matched initials written on the back of one of the photographs found in the safety deposit box. My heart raced as I followed the trail. The records showed that the woman had lived in a small Connecticut town less than 20 miles from the neighborhood where I grew up. 20 miles. I stared at the screen in disbelief. For decades, she had lived practically in our backyard. That discovery only raised more questions. If she had been so close, why had nobody ever mentioned her? Why had my mother preserved photographs and documents connected to her, while keeping her existence hidden from the rest of the family? The deeper I dug, the stranger the story became. Local newspaper archives revealed photographs from church picnics, charity drives, school fundraisers, and community celebrations spanning nearly 30 years. In several of those photographs, I found her again. And in more than one picture, members of my family appeared nearby. Not standing together, not speaking, but present at the same events. Almost as if they occupied the same world while pretending not to know one another. I printed copies and brought them home. My father studied them quietly across the kitchen table. His hands rested on the photographs for several seconds before he finally looked up. "I had forgotten some of these," he whispered. There was sadness in his voice that I had never heard before. Not guilt, not fear, sadness. As the investigation continued, I began visiting people who had lived in the town for many years. Several elderly residents remembered the woman immediately. Their descriptions surprised me. Every person spoke about her with respect. She was one of the kindest women in town. Always helping somebody. Never wanted recognition. Carried herself with quiet dignity. The comments were remarkably consistent. Then one woman in her late 80s said something that made me sit perfectly still. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there were always rumors that she was connected to another family nearby. Nobody ever knew exactly how. But people noticed certain things." "What things?" I asked. The elderly woman smiled gently. "She always showed special interest whenever news about your family appeared in the local paper." A chill ran through me. The woman continued. "Birth announcements, graduations, weddings, community awards. She clipped them all and kept them." I could barely process what I was hearing. Why would a stranger follow another family's life for decades? Unless she was not truly a stranger. That evening I shared everything with my son. The evidence was beginning to paint a picture that none of us fully understood. The next breakthrough came from a box of letters stored with my grandfather's journal. One letter contained a sentence that immediately caught my attention. "Your sacrifice gave our family opportunities we could never repay." I read the line over and over. Sacrifice. The word appeared repeatedly throughout several letters. No details were provided. No explanation was given. Only gratitude. Whoever this woman was, multiple people believe she had given up something important. Something valuable enough that decades later they still felt indebted to her. As more documents surfaced, my father became increasingly emotional. Some evenings he sat silently staring through the window for long periods of time. Other days he shared small memories that seemed insignificant by themselves but meaningful when placed together. He remembered seeing the woman at community events. He remembered my mother receiving occasional letters and storing them privately. He remembered conversations stopping whenever he entered a room. For the first time, I realized my father might not have been protecting a secret. He might have spent his entire life standing near it without fully understanding it. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing another group of letters, I found a note written in my mother's handwriting. The sentence stopped me cold. "You cannot understand my choices until you understand hers." I stared at the words. For years I had believed my mother's story was finally complete. The envelopes, the letters, the reconciliation with my father, the discoveries at the bank. I thought those chapters had revealed everything. Now I was beginning to understand something unsettling. My mother's story could not be separated from the story of the woman in the photograph. And if that was true, then everything I believed about my mother's past might only be part of a much larger truth that had been waiting patiently for decades to be discovered. Part 4: A Promise Made 50 Years Ago. The journal remained open on the dining room table long after the sun disappeared behind the Connecticut hills. The 50-year-old pages seemed fragile, yet every sentence carried a weight that felt stronger than anything the widow had uncovered so far. She sat quietly with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her while her adult son organized photographs and documents into neat stacks. Across the room, her 82-year-old father stared through the window into the darkness, saying very little. For several days after discovering the promise described in her grandfather's journal, the widow found herself thinking less about secrets and more about sacrifice. According to the journal, 3 adults had entered an agreement during the early 1970s. Her grandfather, her mother, and the unidentified woman from the photograph had all pledged to protect someone whose future could have been permanently damaged by public exposure during a difficult time. The journal never used dramatic language. Instead, the entries were calm, practical, and deeply compassionate. That simplicity somehow made the story even more powerful. One evening, the widow carefully reread an entry written in her grandfather's handwriting. He described a conversation around a kitchen table where difficult choices had been discussed for hours. No one involved had benefited personally from the agreement. Instead, they accepted years of misunderstanding because they believed protecting another person's dignity mattered more than receiving credit for their actions. The widow slowly closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. For most of her life she had viewed family history through a very narrow lens. She had assumed that every silence concealed selfishness or fear. Now she was beginning to realize that some silences were created by love. The following weekend she visited her father again. This time she brought several photocopies of the journal pages. They sat together in the living room of his small home. Family photographs lined the shelves around them. The atmosphere felt calmer than it had during any conversation they had shared in recent years. Her father adjusted his glasses and studied one of the pages for several minutes before speaking. "Your mother never wanted praise," he said quietly. "She believed some promises should be honored even when nobody understood them." The widow looked at him carefully. "Did she ever regret it?" she asked. Her father was silent for a long moment. "Not once," he finally replied. "There were times she felt lonely carrying it. There were times she wished things had been easier. But she never regretted protecting the people she cared about." The answer lingered in the room. The widow suddenly remembered countless moments from childhood. Her mother had often disappeared for afternoons without explanation. She had written letters regularly. She had attended community events that seemed unrelated to their family. At the time, none of it appeared unusual. Now those memories seemed connected by an invisible thread. During the next several weeks, the widow continued examining every page of her grandfather's journal. Gradually a clearer picture emerged. The woman in the photograph had not been a stranger standing on the edges of their family's story. She had been part of its foundation. Again and again, journal entries referenced her kindness, reliability, and willingness to place the needs of others before her own. Yet her name rarely appeared in public records connected to the family. It was as though history itself had quietly stepped around her contributions. One afternoon the widow discovered a folded note tucked between 2 journal pages. The paper was yellowed with age. Unlike the journal entries, this message appeared to have been written by her mother. The brief note described the burden of keeping a promise that could never be fully explained. It spoke of patience, faith, and the hope that one day future generations would understand why certain truths had remained hidden. The widow felt tears gathering in her eyes. For years she had believed her mother left behind unanswered questions. Now she was beginning to understand that her mother had left behind something far more valuable: A lesson about loyalty, compassion, and responsibility. Later that evening she shared the note with her father and son. The three of them sat together around the same table where so many discoveries had unfolded. No one spoke for several moments after reading it. Finally her son broke the silence. "Grandma spent her entire life protecting people," he said softly. The elderly father nodded. "Yes," he replied. "And she never expected anyone to know." The widow looked down at the note again. She now understood why her father had resisted discussing the woman in the photograph for so many years. He had not been trying to hide wrongdoing. He had been trying to honor people who believed their sacrifices should remain private. Yet despite that understanding, one question still remained unanswered. Who exactly had been protected by the promise made 50 years earlier? The journal hinted at the answer but never stated it directly. And as the widow carefully turned another page, she discovered a new reference that suggested the protected individual might still have living relatives somewhere in Connecticut today. Part 5. The Hidden Branch of the Family. The discovery at the end of the journal entry stayed with the widow for days. Every time she thought she had finally reached the end of her mother's hidden story, another door seemed to open. The possibility that the person protected by the promise might still have living relatives somewhere in Connecticut transformed the entire investigation. What had once felt like a historical mystery now felt connected to the present. One cool October morning, the widow spread the journal, photographs, and notes across her dining room table once again. Her adult son joined her with a notebook filled with dates and names they had collected during the previous weeks. Together they carefully reviewed every reference connected to the promise. Most entries remained frustratingly vague. Her grandfather had deliberately avoided recording certain names, likely to prevent future readers from uncovering the secret too easily. Yet one detail appeared repeatedly. Several entries mentioned annual visits to a small coastal town less than 30 miles from where the widow had grown up. The town's name appeared so frequently that it could not be a coincidence. Later that afternoon, the widow and her son drove there. The town looked much as countless New England communities did, with tree-lined streets, small businesses, and historic homes that seemed untouched by time. As they walked through the local historical society, the widow explained her search to a volunteer archivist. The elderly woman listened carefully before leading them toward a collection of community records dating back more than 50 years. Hours passed as they reviewed newspaper clippings, event programs, and photographs from local gatherings. Then the widow suddenly froze. There, in a photograph from a community fundraiser held in 1974, stood the mysterious woman from her grandfather's journal. She was smiling beside several volunteers. More surprisingly, standing only a few feet away was the widow's mother. The two women appeared comfortable together, almost like lifelong friends. The widow stared at the image for several moments. This was the clearest evidence yet that her mother and the woman had maintained a close relationship for many years. The archivist noticed her reaction. "Do you know her?" she asked. The widow hesitated. "I am trying to understand who she was." The archivist studied the photograph before nodding slowly. Many people around here remembered her. She was known for helping families during difficult times. Very private woman. Very kind. Those words echoed descriptions already found in the journal. As the afternoon continued, the widow uncovered additional photographs spanning nearly 2 decades. Again and again the same pattern appeared. The woman remained present at community events attended by her mother, yet there was never any public explanation connecting the two families. That evening, the widow returned home carrying copies of the photographs. Her father was waiting in the living room when she arrived. Age had slowed his movements, but the moment he saw the images, a complicated expression crossed his face. Not fear this time. Not resistance. Something closer to sadness mixed with affection. He carefully picked up one photograph and smiled faintly. "Your mother always admired her," he said. "She admired her strength." The widow sat beside him. "Then why keep everything secret?" she asked. Her father remained quiet for several moments before answering. "Because the promise was never about hiding shame. It was about protecting dignity. There is a difference." The statement lingered in the room. For years the widow had associated family secrets with embarrassment or wrongdoing. Yet the deeper she explored this story, the more she encountered people making difficult choices out of compassion rather than fear. Her father slowly opened a small box he had brought from home. Inside were several letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The widow immediately recognized her mother's handwriting on some of the envelopes. Others belonged to the mysterious woman. "I kept these because your mother asked me to," he said softly. She believed there might come a day when someone needed to understand the full story. With trembling hands, the widow untied the ribbon and began reading. The letters revealed years of friendship, mutual support, and shared responsibility. More importantly, they contained references to a young person whose future had depended upon the promise made decades earlier. Although the letters never identified that person directly, one clue appeared repeatedly. The protected individual had eventually moved away from Connecticut and started a new life under circumstances carefully arranged by several adults working together. The widow felt her pulse quicken. For the first time, the mystery seemed close to revealing its center. As she reached the final letter in the bundle, she discovered a name of a distant city and a handwritten note from her mother. The message contained only one sentence. "If the truth is ever needed, begin your search here." The widow looked up at her father. Neither spoke. Both understood that the next step would take them beyond family memories and into the life of a person whose existence had quietly shaped their family history for more than half a century. Part 6: The Contradiction. The single sentence written by her mother remained on the widow's mind for nearly a week. "If the truth is ever needed, begin your search here." She had read the words dozens of times, yet they felt no less significant with each reading. The distant city mentioned in the letter was located several states away, far beyond the familiar roads and communities that had shaped her family's history. Whatever answers remained hidden would require her to leave Connecticut for the first time since beginning the investigation. On a crisp November morning, the widow sat at her kitchen table with her adult son and her father. Maps, letters, and journal entries were spread before them. Her father appeared thoughtful, almost relieved. For months he had carried the weight of old memories. Now, with so much already revealed, he seemed prepared to let the remaining pieces come into the light. "Your mother always believed the truth would eventually find its way home," he said quietly. "Maybe this is what she meant." The widow nodded. She had spent years believing that family history was something fixed and unchangeable. Now she understood that every generation carried only part of the story. Before leaving, she carefully organized copies of every important document. The original letters remained safely stored at home. She wanted to ensure that nothing would be lost after coming so far. 2 days later, she and her son began the trip. The drive took them through rolling hills, small towns, and stretches of highway lined with late autumn trees. Along the way they discussed everything they had learned. Each discovery seemed connected to a larger pattern. Again and again they returned to the same question. Who had been important enough for 3 adults to protect for more than 50 years? By the time they reached the city mentioned in the letter, evening lights were beginning to glow across the downtown streets. It was larger and busier than the quiet Connecticut communities they knew. The next morning they visited the public library, hoping to locate records connected to the name and address referenced in one of the letters. The librarian directed them toward archive city directories and local historical records. Hours passed before they found something useful. An old directory listed a woman whose name matched references found in the letters. More importantly, the address remained connected to the same family for decades. The widow felt her pulse quicken. This was the strongest lead they had uncovered. Later that afternoon they drove to the neighborhood. The house stood on a quiet street shaded by large maple trees. It was modest but well maintained, with flower beds arranged carefully along the front walkway. The widow remained seated in the car for several moments, gathering her thoughts. The possibility that someone inside might unknowingly hold answers to questions stretching back half a century felt overwhelming. Finally, she walked to the front door and knocked. After a short wait, a woman in her early 60s answered. She greeted them politely but looked puzzled by the unexpected visit. The widow introduced herself and explained that she was researching family history connected to Connecticut. At first, the woman seemed uncertain. Then the widow mentioned the name from the letters. Everything changed. The woman's expression softened immediately. "I know that name," she said. "She was my aunt." The widow felt her breath catch. For a moment neither she nor her son spoke. They had spent months following fragments of evidence, and now they stood face to face with someone directly connected to the mystery. The woman invited them inside. Family photographs filled the living room shelves. Several instantly captured the widow's attention. There, displayed among ordinary family memories, was the same woman from the photograph found in her grandfather's safety deposit box. The resemblance was unmistakable. Over coffee, the woman shared stories passed down through her family. Her aunt had been known for helping others quietly. She rarely spoke about her own sacrifices. Yet she often mentioned friends in Connecticut whom she trusted deeply. One of those friends, according to family stories, was the widow's mother. As the conversation continued, another detail emerged. The mysterious woman had maintained correspondence for decades with someone whose identity she never revealed publicly. Family members assumed the person had been a distant relative or lifelong friend. The widow exchanged a glance with her son. The protected individual appeared once again at the center of the story. Before they left, the woman disappeared into another room and returned carrying a small storage box. Inside were carefully preserved letters, photographs, and personal notes. "I always wondered why she wanted these saved," the woman said. "Maybe she knew someone would come looking one day." The widow gently opened the box. Near the bottom rested a sealed envelope that had never been opened. Written across the front in fading ink were words that made her heart stop. The envelope was addressed to her mother, and beneath the name appeared a date from more than 40 years earlier. For the second time in her life, the widow found herself holding a message that seemed capable of changing everything she thought she knew about her family's past. Part 7. What her mother never finished. The sealed envelope rested in the widow's hands with a weight that seemed far greater than paper alone could carry. For several moments she simply stared at her mother's name written across the front in fading blue ink. More than 40 years had passed since the letter had been mailed, yet somehow it had survived untouched, waiting quietly in a storage box hundreds of miles away. The woman who had inherited the box sat patiently across from her, equally curious about its contents. The widow's adult son leaned forward, unable to hide his anticipation. After everything they had uncovered, another unopened letter felt almost impossible to believe. Carefully, the widow broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. She immediately recognized it as belonging to the mysterious woman who had appeared throughout the photographs, journals, and family records. Taking a deep breath, she began reading aloud. The letter was not dramatic. It contained no shocking confession or sensational secret. Instead, it described a difficult decision made years earlier by several adults who believed they were acting in the best interests of a young person whose future had become uncertain. As the widow continued reading, a clearer picture finally began to emerge. Decades ago, a teenager had found themselves caught in circumstances that could have limited opportunities and permanently altered the course of their life. Concerned about the consequences, the widow's grandfather, her mother, and the woman from the photograph had worked together to provide support, guidance, and a chance for a new beginning. The arrangement required discretion. Not because anyone had done something wrong, but because privacy and dignity were considered essential. The widow paused several times while reading. Every sentence revealed another layer of compassion that had remained hidden for generations. Her mother had not been protecting a secret for personal gain. She had been protecting a person's future. When she reached the final page, a single paragraph captured everyone's attention. The woman wrote that she hoped one day the protected individual would understand how many people had quietly cared about them. She also mentioned that a collection of letters had been entrusted to another person for safekeeping. The widow looked up immediately. "Another collection of letters," her son said softly. The woman across from them nodded slowly. "I remember hearing something about that when I was younger." She stood and walked toward a bookshelf in the corner of the room. After searching for several minutes, she returned carrying an old address book. Many of the entries had faded with time, yet one name had been marked with a small star. According to a handwritten note beside it, the person had been a close friend of the mysterious woman for many years. More importantly, they still lived less than an hour away. The next morning, the widow and her son followed the lead. The drive took them through quiet neighborhoods and winding roads lined with bare November trees. By midday they arrived at a small retirement community. The friend was now in her late 80s but remained remarkably sharp and welcoming. When the widow explained her connection to the woman in the photograph, the elderly resident smiled warmly. "I have been wondering if someone would come asking these questions someday," she said. The widow felt a familiar surge of anticipation. The elderly woman disappeared briefly and returned carrying a carefully preserved binder. Inside were dozens of letters exchanged over several decades. Some were written by the mysterious woman. Others came from the widow's mother. Together they documented years of friendship, concern, and quiet acts of support. But one detail stood out above everything else. The letters repeatedly referenced the same individual. Unlike previous documents, these letters included a first name. For the first time, the protected person was no longer anonymous. The widow stared at the name in silence. She had never heard it before. Yet it appeared throughout the correspondence like the center point around which every sacrifice revolved. The letters described educational opportunities, career milestones, family celebrations, and personal achievements. It became clear that the protected individual had gone on to build a successful and meaningful life. The promise made 50 years earlier had accomplished exactly what it intended. As the widow turned the final pages, she discovered a recent note added only a few years earlier. The handwriting belonged to the mysterious woman. The message explained that the protected individual was still alive. Even more astonishing, they had recently returned to Connecticut after spending decades elsewhere. The widow felt her heart race. After months of investigation, the person whose future had inspired generations of sacrifice was no longer a figure hidden in history. They were a living person. Somewhere in Connecticut, they were continuing a life shaped by choices made long before they could understand them. And tucked inside the back cover of the binder was a modern address that suggested the widow might finally be closer than ever to meeting them face to face. Part 8: The Last Missing Piece. The address tucked inside the back cover of the binder felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had taken months to assemble. The widow held the small slip of paper carefully as she and her son drove back toward Connecticut. Neither spoke much during the trip. Both were processing the same realization. After following journals, letters, photographs, and promises that stretched across more than 50 years, they were finally approaching the person whose life had quietly connected every part of the story. The address belonged to a small coastal community, less than 40 miles from the widow's hometown. The irony was impossible to ignore. The answers she had searched for across multiple states had ultimately led her back home. When they arrived 2 days later, the November sky was clear and bright. The neighborhood overlooked a calm stretch of water where sailboats drifted gently in the distance. It felt peaceful, almost ordinary. Yet for the widow, standing on that street felt like standing at the edge of history. Before visiting the address, she met with her father. The elderly man listened quietly as she described everything they had learned. When she finally mentioned the name of the protected individual, he closed his eyes for several moments. The reaction surprised her. "You know the name," she said softly. Her father nodded. "I have known it for many years." The widow felt a mixture of surprise and understanding. Unlike earlier discoveries, this revelation no longer felt like a betrayal. She now understood the burden he had carried. The promise had never belonged to him alone. It had been shared by multiple people across generations. "Why did nobody ever tell me?" she asked. Her father looked toward an old photograph of her mother displayed on a nearby shelf. "Because your mother believed every person deserved the right to tell their own story when they were ready," he replied. The answer stayed with her long after she left. The following afternoon, accompanied by her son, she finally approached the address. The home was modest and welcoming, surrounded by carefully maintained flower beds and evergreen shrubs. Nothing about it suggested the extraordinary role its owner had unknowingly played in her family's history. The widow hesitated briefly before knocking. A few moments later, the door opened. Standing before her was a man in his early 60s. His expression was warm but curious. The widow immediately noticed something unexpected. Certain features reminded her of photographs she had seen throughout the investigation. Not enough to suggest a direct family connection, but enough to evoke a strange sense of familiarity. She introduced herself and explained that she had spent months researching family history, connected to several people from Connecticut. When she mentioned the names of her mother and the mysterious woman from the photographs, the man's expression changed instantly. "Please come in," he said quietly. The conversation lasted for hours. Piece by piece, the remaining mystery finally unfolded. The man explained that throughout his life he had known there were people who had quietly helped create opportunities for him. He had received support during important moments of his education and early career. Letters occasionally arrived offering encouragement. Certain family friends remained present across decades. Yet he had never fully understood how deeply connected their efforts had been. The widow shared copies of photographs, journal entries, and letters. Together they reviewed the evidence. Several times the man became emotional as he recognized names and faces from his past. Gradually the complete story emerged. The promise made 50 years earlier had centered on ensuring that a young person facing difficult circumstances would have every opportunity to build a successful future. Her mother, grandfather, and the woman from the photograph had each contributed in different ways. Some offered financial assistance. Others provided guidance, mentorship, or emotional support. None of them sought recognition. Their goal had simply been to help. As the afternoon sunlight faded, the man opened a drawer and removed a small framed photograph. The image showed him as a teenager standing beside the widow's mother and the mysterious woman. All three were smiling. The widow stared at the picture for several moments. It was the first image she had ever seen that connected everyone at the center of the story together in a single moment. "I always wondered why they cared so much," the man said softly. "Now I finally understand." The widow felt tears gathering in her eyes. For months she had searched for hidden truths, expecting to uncover conflict, betrayal, or scandal. Instead, she had discovered something far more powerful. The greatest secret in her family's history had not been wrongdoing. It had been kindness. Yet as she prepared to leave, the man revealed one final surprise. Several years earlier, shortly before her mother's passing, she had visited him personally. During that visit, she entrusted him with a sealed package and gave very specific instructions. The package was to remain unopened until someone from her family arrived seeking the complete truth. The widow looked at the box resting on the table between them. Her mother's handwriting covered the label. After everything that had already been revealed, she realized the journey was not quite over. One final message still remained. Part 9: The Legacy Beyond the Secret. The sealed package sat between them on the dining room table as late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the Connecticut shoreline. For a long moment, the widow simply stared at her mother's familiar handwriting. After months of discoveries, unexpected truths, and emotional revelations, she felt both eager and afraid to learn what remained inside. The man who had safeguarded the package for years quietly stepped back, giving her space. Her adult son sat beside her, watching silently. Together they had followed a trail that began with a single envelope and had gradually uncovered a hidden legacy of compassion that stretched across generations. With careful hands, the widow untied the ribbon securing the package. Inside she found several neatly folded letters, a small photograph, and a leather-bound notebook much thinner than the journals they had already studied. The first letter was addressed directly to her. As she unfolded the pages, her mother's voice seemed to come alive through every carefully chosen word. Her mother explained that if her daughter was reading this letter, it meant she had already uncovered the promise that had connected so many lives. She wrote that the purpose of the hidden story had never been secrecy for its own sake. Instead, it had been protection. Certain people had needed time, dignity, and opportunity to build their own futures without feeling burdened by debts from the past. The widow continued reading as tears slowly filled her eyes. Her mother described the difficult choices faced by multiple families decades earlier. During a period when opportunities were limited and personal struggles often remained hidden, several adults chose to work together to help a vulnerable young person succeed. No contracts had required their involvement. No recognition had been expected. They simply believed helping someone build a better future was the right thing to do. The second letter contained something even more surprising. Her mother revealed that the kindness did not end with a single generation. Over the years, those who had benefited from support quietly helped others in return. Acts of generosity multiplied far beyond what anyone originally imagined. Scholarships were funded anonymously. Educational opportunities were created. Families received assistance during difficult periods. None of the recipients knew the full story. Yet each act of kindness became another link in an invisible chain stretching across decades. The widow turned to the photograph included in the package. It showed her mother standing beside the mysterious woman and several young adults gathered at a community event many years earlier. Everyone in the picture was smiling. For the first time, the widow noticed something she had previously overlooked. Her mother did not appear burdened by secrets. She appeared proud. The notebook contained one final surprise. Rather than documenting hidden scandals or painful conflicts, it recorded dozens of lives touched by the original promise. There were handwritten notes describing graduations, successful careers, marriages, volunteer work, and community projects. The simple decision made half a century earlier had quietly improved the lives of people the original participants would never even meet. By the time she finished reading, evening had arrived. The room was silent except for the distant sound of waves outside. The man who had protected the package looked toward her gently. "Your mother wanted you to understand that the story was never about what was hidden," he said. "It was about what people chose to do after making difficult choices." The widow nodded slowly. For much of her life, she had believed family history was defined by mistakes, misunderstandings, and unanswered questions. Now she understood something different. A family's true legacy was often built through quiet acts of sacrifice that nobody celebrated publicly. Before leaving, she called her father. The elderly man listened carefully as she described everything contained in the package. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. Finally, he spoke. "Your mother always hoped one day you would see the whole picture." Several weeks later, the family gathered once again at the cemetery beneath golden autumn trees. This time there were no mysteries left to solve. The widow stood beside her mother's grave holding the final letters. Her father stood nearby, supported by his grandson. Together they reflected not on secrets but on lessons. The journey that began with uncertainty had ended with understanding. The envelopes, journals, photographs, and forgotten records had all pointed toward the same truth. Love expressed through quiet sacrifice can outlast generations. As sunlight illuminated the colorful leaves around them, the widow felt a deep sense of peace. Her mother's final gift had not been another mystery. It had been clarity. The story was complete. The questions were answered. And the legacy left behind was not one of hidden burdens, but of compassion, forgiveness, and hope carried forward into the future. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for visiting.